We've all seen the images of the fires and of the floods. We've witnessed the droughts. So timed with laser-like accuracy for maximum COP impact, key data today on what governments globally are doing to meet the challenge of the climate crisis they have allowed to happen.
I do believe we're getting to a point where we consign coal power to history. A brighter future comes ever closer, a future of cleaner air, cheaper power, and good green jobs.
Headline hyperbole last week, but climate action tracker data released this afternoon shows Glasgow's promises alone will not get us where we have to be.
If we continue emitting at the level we are until 2030, then we're well on the way to losing Paris. And whether or not we can limit emissions in the next decade will mean whether or not the Paris Agreement is made or broken.
It's like this. Even with the Glasgow promises, 2030 emissions will still be twice as high as needed to reach the 1.5 Celsius, the goal of the Paris deal this COP is supposed to deliver. Without longer-term targets, global temperatures in 2100 will be 2.4 Celsius higher, meaning catastrophic change. If governments continue doing what they're doing, not promising, that figure becomes 2.7 Celsius. Even at a 2 Celsius global heat rise, this Met Office map released today shows over 1 billion people at risk from heat and humidity across the global south. So how do we leave this pathway to disaster? Well, today's report says rich economies must stop coal-fired power stations by 2030, the rest of the world by 2040.
Moreover, it says you can't just move from coal to gas, because that is just simply substituting one form of fossil fuel pollution for another.
The positive news is we can still limit temperature rise to 1.8 Celsius if all governments deliver on their promises. A big if.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
But remember, when they signed the Paris climate deal 6 years ago, we were heading for a 4 Celsius rise by the end of the century, not 2.4. Progress is happening. On Saturday, he was dressed as a panda, protesting on the streets of Glasgow with 100,000 others. Today, we met up inside the COP conference.
Promises are getting better, but what it does really show is that there's not enough action. So, at the end of this decade, if we don't cut emissions from coal, oil and gas, if we don't do more to protect and restore nature, we are simply not going to be able to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is what we need to do to avoid the worst of climate change.
High in the Cairngorm Mountains, the Sphinx. It's the UK's snowiest place, the nearest thing we have to a glacier. In 3 centuries, the snow here hardly ever melted. It's vanished 3 times in the past 5 years. Citizen scientist Ian Cameron treks up here regularly to monitor this lonely, silent statement of a climate in crisis.
Something which historically was always there has now started to melt, and melt frequently. So for me, that sends a big warning shot out. It might not grab the attention the way that forest fires in Australia do, or the increasing prevalence of disappearing glaciers in Greenland, but in their own way they tell as important a story as all these other world events.
Back inside the COP, a team of 15 ministers from world governments into its second day now of somehow forging a unanimous 197 country agreement on saving the planet.
We are making progress at COP26, but we still have a mountain to climb over the next few days.
So siren statistics to galvanise greater ambition. Tomorrow, the Prime Minister arrives by train to Glasgow to attempt more of that. There is time, but not much.
So what are the crunch points in these sprawling negotiations, which have been described by one very weary delegate as like playing 3-dimensional chess with spaghetti? Well, over to our climate reporter, Simon Roach, who's in the conference centre. Simon.
Well, it's easy to forget that the actual negotiations here at COP26 are about these legal documents agreed between countries, hundreds of pages long. The vast majority of the text goes uneasily, but the controversial bits that countries are squabbling over here in Glasgow, and this can be single words like will versus may, now they go into square brackets in the document until they're agreed. These are often tiny but heavily disputed differences to the text, which can make or break climate targets. For example, let's go back to what was discussed at the Paris conference in 2015 and take a look at this bar chart. Negotiators began with just under 1,800 of these square brackets in the document, and over the 10 days they slowly whittled them down until there were just 132 left at the end. Well, why is that so important? It is still that text which they're negotiating details on here in Glasgow. Now let's go to one of the big sticking points this week. In the Paris Agreement, there's a whole section on this idea of carbon markets, or how carbon trading can help countries meet their climate pledges. For example, should a rich country be able to pay a poor country to build a wind farm instead of a coal power plant? A simple idea, fiendishly hard to make work. All these technical rules are in a section called Article 6, still being argued about in Glasgow after years and years. Here's the progress they've made so far as those negotiators chisel away. That square bracket count is coming down, but 290 disputes are still to be settled.
Okay, Simon, so big problems with the carbon market negotiations. Anything else we should know about?
Well, you're quite right. Just one example on those carbon markets, there's a standoff between African countries and the US on how some of the money from that carbon trading is used. The African bloc says they should get a chunk of those billions to help them deal with climate impacts. The US says no way, that would be akin to a kind of international tax. But after that, there is a big moment coming tonight. The UK presidency is putting out the first draft of what they're calling the cover decision, a kind of final super text, if you like. Expect to hear a lot on that tomorrow. Why? Well, right now, we are far off that 1.5 temperature goal. And at the moment, national plans won't be updated until 2025, far too late. So they need to do something to change that. Coming back with pledges more than every 5 years, we may say that in the cover decision. What's clear is that just as every minute in these talks count, so does every single word in texts like these.
Simon, thanks very much. Well, earlier I spoke to the government's chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, now a household name, of course, thanks to the pandemic. And I asked him if climate change is a bigger challenge for us than COVID.
Well, it's certainly a more durable challenge, and it's one that's going to go on for decades. And if we don't do something, it's going to go on for many, many, many decades. And therefore, yes, it's a long-term, durable challenge with huge implications.
And do you think enough is being done at this conference to try and solve that?
Well, I hope so. Today's Science and Innovation Day, and we've been very clear about some of the things that we think need to be done. I think we got a good set of announcements last week. I think it's great that we've gone from 30% of countries saying they've got a net zero ambition to 90%. What I've been clear about is pledges are great. What we need to see is plans, very detailed science and evidence-based plans to get there. And that, I think, is where we need to move to after this conference. And of course, there's a lot more to go this week in terms of announcements and things that leaders will agree to.
We saw in the treatment of the pandemic how science really comes into its own. Science has had an enormous impact on vaccines and the therapeutics, and sometimes the politics gets in the way. Do you see a similar pattern here?
Well, I think there is a similar pattern in some ways, in that there are two big things that I think were important in the pandemic. One was science and technology came with all sorts of potential solutions, vaccines, therapeutics, and so on. And the other is we all pulled together to make some difficult choices in order to try and restrict the virus. And I think those are the two things that actually we need to think about here in climate change. What we do, what science and technology can deliver, and then of course other things like land and nature-based solutions are key.
So just finally, the pandemic was a bit of a dress rehearsal for the way we treat climate change, but it's going to last a lot longer.
Well, I'm not sure I'd see it exactly like that. I mean, the climate has been, the COVID challenge has been absolutely awful, and many people.
I'm not trying to make light of it, but in terms of the challenges that we face both scientifically, politically, and socially.
In some of the parallels in terms of science advice, and it's very interesting that many countries across the world are asking what is the science advice system we need in our government in order to tackle climate change. I think that's been accelerated by what's happened in the last 2 years.
So Patrick Vallance, thank you very much.
Thank you.